So I'm here with Julia Leventon, who's the project lead of Plus Change. Plus Change is an EU-funded project which is looking at creating strategies and decision-making processes for land use and taking into account issues like climate change, biodiversity, and human well-being. And the way they're doing that is through 12 practice cases, which represent real-world examples of land use across Europe and decision making and action within specific geographic areas. So, Julia, thank you for joining me today. Would
Thank
you
you
like
for
to kick
having me.
by telling me what were the criteria that you used to select those practice cases?
Sure. So the practice cases were intended to be really diverse across Europe. So we wanted to be able to really do a deep dive into the different context, factors, social processes that were shaping decision-making processes around land use. And that meant that we wanted practice cases that were dealing with a big range of challenges in their land use, but also that had very different social and political contexts for that decision making. And so we've made sure that we've got a spread sort of across and up and down of Europe. We've got a particular focus on those from what we would normally call Central and Eastern Europe, so sort of former socialist countries, really to look at the way in which those decision-making contexts, particularly around questions of participation or responsibilities around planning and land use decision-making, are possibly different, or how that shapes decision-making processes. And we've also tried to have a spectrum between those cases that are in rural areas, those that are in urban areas, and those in between, so this peri-urban area, which ends up sort of absorbing stresses in both directions, really. And whatever happens in urban areas and in rural areas then sort of has a knock-on impact on those peri-urban areas. So we've got to cross that spectrum as well. So difference was the main criteria for including a practice case.
Sorry, I imagine that makes things more interesting, more useful in the long run, but perhaps more complex at the time of doing the project, right? All right, so what in those practice areas, what are some of the historical and geographical factors that have shaped the way that land is currently used in those areas? You know, what shapes behavior and decision making?
Mhm. So actually, this is a really interesting question at the moment because we've just come to the end of our work package that looks at historical land use change. And we've done this big narrative understanding across Europe, drawing on data from across the practice cases and input and workshops from across the practice cases, looking at precisely that. So how has land use changed and what has shaped those changes? And what we're finding is that, yeah, there is actually a split between what we would understand as sort of older EU member states and those that are newer member states. And it's not really that there's a difference in the exact drivers that are there of land use change. And that's things like agricultural pressures. So the need that sort of driving into expanding agricultural areas or managing floods or water scarcity. They're particularly big in there. Mobility demands, infrastructure demands are shaping land use, forestry. So the drivers are quite similar, but the timeframes over which they act. So we're almost seeing a sort of a split between those in the older member states, which you can say, okay, the drivers have sort of happened about 20 years earlier, and so we're seeing these patterns of land use change, and then almost sort of 20 years previous, we're seeing the same drivers in happening in what would be Central and Eastern Europe. So I think for me, that's been really enlightening to understand that, okay, it's not necessarily that we're dealing with different drivers. We're more just seeing these drivers act out over different timescales and have different opportunities to act related to political shifts, which points to the idea that it's really about the political processes of decision making and those infrastructures for who decides what and what the policies are acting that are really shaping what land use looks like. And so that leads us into looking at the drivers that are embedded in things like the Common Agricultural Policy, or increasingly, hopefully, into climate adaptations and biodiversity strategies and how those are going to act on land use change. So it's really on the policy and the political and decision-making structures that are shaping land use.
Okay, and that you said there's a sort of the same processes, but a bit of a time lag. And is that to do with like the economic development of that country or its entry into the EU then?
Yeah, a lot of it's to do with entry into the EU. So a lot of countries, when they join the EU, then have to absorb all of the EU legislation, and that then has sort of over time, as they're given sort of grace periods to take on board that policy, that then sort of leads to these shifts as those policies come into force.
All right, and with regard to climate change, this will be, how to phrase this, we're almost sort of all going at the same pace on that, a slow pace. But that's something that would not have been a consideration, when certain countries joined, other countries are joining more recently, and it is. Are you finding that there's still a lag, there's still differences in terms of sort of responding to climate change, absorbing those needs?
So I think that's a really interesting question, because actually the big sort of policies that are driving land use up until now have been things like the Common Agricultural Policy, or policies that shape our demand for certain materials, so for forest products, agricultural products, policies that shape things like housing demand and supply, or water management, for example. And so I think in the future, we're going to be seeing a lot more explicitly climate policy. So things like climate adaptation plans in some of the practice cases that we're working in, they're becoming quite big. But I think that to date, actually, those shifts have not really, because climate's in there, it's mainstreamed through policies, but it's not been the sort of the primary focus of a lot of the policies that are driving land use change. And so actually the question becomes more sort of, what's the impact going to be going forwards, and how do these different sort of starting points in these countries shape what's possible, how they're able to adapt, what these policies are going to look like, and therefore play out on the ground. So I think that this is something that we're really hoping to dive into and unpack a lot more as we're sort of moving in the project from this historical what has been into a more future oriented and what's coming, what's land use going to look like in the next sort of 20, 50, 100 years.
All right, you mentioned examples of adaptation, decision making, or planning in some of the regions. Could you give me maybe one or two examples to illustrate that?
Yeah. So, for example, a couple of our practice cases actually, but for example, around Amsterdam, we have a practice case there, and they're really looking at water management, and water becomes such a huge question when we're talking about climate adaptation. Sort of, where is water? Do we have the right amount at the right time for the right uses? And so really in our practice case in Amsterdam, these are the kinds of questions that they're asking. And how that then plays out around questions of land sealing, agricultural need, recreational needs, and where water is in the landscape for who. But actually, I think a lot of the practice cases are more approaching the whole question of adaptation more as an embedded within what does future landscape look like when it is climate resilient, it leads to adaptation, it potentially has mitigation benefits, but it also has well-being benefits, and it has benefits for biodiversity. So it becomes really difficult to extract out what does adaptation look like in land use because it's adaptation and all of these things integrated. And so actually things that are good for adaptation, so increasing green space, for example, or integrating water and greenery within city planning, they're good also for biodiversity, and they should be good for human well-being as well. And so I do find it quite hard to pull out the what does an adapted landscape look like, because it's what does a healthy, thriving landscape look like for people and nature?
All right, that's a great answer. So with that in mind, it's obviously a difficult job for land use planners to balance, sometimes you need climate mitigation, as you said, adaptation, resilience, also biodiversity conservation. Seems like the two would go hand in hand, not always necessarily the case. Then obviously societal well-being and economic needs. Huge balancing act there. How can people sort of start to approach that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to complicate it further, because it's not just people as one homogenous block, right? There's lots of different people in an area, and everybody has different needs and wants and wishes for what they see a thriving future as being. And we also know that traditionally and historically across decision making, there are groups of people who have been marginalized, and so their voices have not been heard so well, and perhaps landscapes are currently not working, or land use is not working for them as well as for other people. So it's a huge challenge for planners and decision makers. And also depending on what level of decision making we're talking about. Are we talking about European policy, national policy, or local landscape planners, or even, I don't know, the person that manages a piece of land, that landowner or land manager? So there's all these questions of integrating all these different wants and needs, and at multiple decision making levels. And I think generally the trend in decision making would be, okay, so let's come up with some technical tools that help us quantify this. How can we create, for example, a mapping system that allows us to say, okay, what if I build a park here? What does that do for climate goals, biodiversity goals, for social goals? And try and build that into a modeling system. And we do that in Plus Change because it's an important input to decision making to have that kind of information. And the better that information is, the better we can inform decisions. But in Plus Change, we also consider that as just one input to decision making. And we're looking at ways in which such tools are used, and are used as part of deliberation and negotiation in ways that pull all those diversity of voices together. So we've been working with creative processes, a possible landscapes process, which deliberately seeks to engage diverse range of actors at the local level in a creative process, in thinking about what do we want our landscape to look like? Why? Where's that going? What are the drivers for that? Who will benefit from this, and how? And we've come up with these quite imaginative scenarios. Then we're able to use that both to sort of stimulate discussion and debate and deliberation, which is really at the heart of decision making, to go alongside technical tools, but also as a process to learn from that process and put that out there as also one of the tools in our toolkit of decision making, a deliberative process. How do we engage that? How do we engage with people so that our decision making is more negotiated, open, robust, and not just based on numbers and mapping?
Yeah, that's so important, I think, isn't it? Especially in the kind of current political climate where a lot of people feeling quite disenfranchised, I think. So you've mentioned some of the stakeholders. Who is it? Which groups are you working with in these practice regions? And huge challenges, I imagine, in ensuring that all their needs and all their voices are heard. How are you tackling that?
Oh, how are we tackling that? That's a big question. One of the things that is special to me about the Plus Change project is that most of our practice cases are run by practice partners. So we have, for example, the Regional Development Agency for a number of our practice cases is actually a full partner in the Plus Change project, or the management authority that manages that landscape, or the planning authority that manages that area. And so they're full partners in the project, and that means that they're running the project process in the practice case according to their expertise. And so they're already connected on the ground. They know who their stakeholders are, and they've been through a process with us in the project about explicitly thinking about questions of ethics and justice and marginalized communities who they might need to reach out to engage with. So who the stakeholders are then really varies by the practice case. But each practice case has sufficient expertise in that location in order to make sure that different stakeholders are engaged. And so you might find that in one of our smaller, more rural practice cases, so for example, the Kaigu peatland in Latvia, they have a very small number of stakeholders because it's a very small practice case, but it includes the company that manages the peatland for extraction at the moment, and it includes a huge range of, for a small practice case, a big range of local government decision makers, civil society, and that private sector, and also research partners. And so they're all engaged through those workshops. And a similar process happens across all of the practice cases, and they're sort of running a series of stakeholder workshops and engagement processes to bring the project into those practice cases. In addition, we have 15 project ambassadors who we've recruited centrally to the project. They work a small amount of their time. They've all got full-time jobs elsewhere. But they're 15 people that we've engaged to help bring in traditionally underrepresented voices into the project. And so they help us by pointing out things like, okay, but you haven't really thought about disabled people in this question, or you haven't really thought about Roma rights in this question. And they bring those kinds of critical questions and reflections into the project and help us broaden who we consider as the stakeholders and how we engage with those stakeholders and take those out to a broader audience.
That's great. It sounds like, in the future, if policymakers are to follow your recommendations, we could have more inclusive kind of consultation processes and policy that actually works for everybody. That would be the goal, right?
I would really hope so. Yeah. And I mean, this question of ethics and justice we've really sort of mainstreamed it through the whole project. So it's a specific task that we have in the project is to think about ethics and justice in land use planning. And we've made sure that we have a process in place that weaves it through every bit of research and practice that we're doing within the project.
Okay, wonderful. So thinking about those practice cases and them being representative of sort of land use across Europe, what you mentioned earlier, like desirable future scenarios for them, what would you like to see, in an ideal world, kind of 20, 50, 100 years from now in some of those areas?
Oh, that's a really good question. What would I like to see?
We could make it more general if you prefer kind of European land use in general rather than the specific examples.
Mm-hmm. I would like to see diversity in land use. This has been something that I've found quite powerful coming out of this possible landscapes process that we've run through the project, is that there's a lot of creativity at the local level. So, and we're looking at these possible landscapes, which are all narrated on our website. So you can go and explore all these different possible futures. And they're so place specific. So for example, it's looking at in South Moravia in the Czech Republic, sort of abandoned land, but bringing it back into being public space that's usable and is biodiverse and gives green space, but it's also got elements of sort of the region's winemaking culture in there. And so that's the kind of thing that we're seeing in these possible landscapes. It's really place-specific, culturally relevant, social spaces that really sort of stretch what we were, the bounds of our imagination, what we were expecting to see. And for me, that then comes back to, what do I want to see across Europe? Well, I want to see space for that kind of diversity and for those kinds of culturally specific, socially specific solutions and landscapes, so that when you're in South Moravia, it looks different from when you're in the city of Nitra in Slovakia. They're close together, but they're different. And there needs to be a way, despite having common policy goals around climate and biodiversity, that we're able to honor that kind of diversity and difference in wishes and difference in cultures and celebrate that.
All right, that would be a great thing to aim for. So what's needed to get there? You know, what sort of incentives, drivers? Actually, we haven't talked much about the kind of barriers and the challenges in these regions. I don't know if would you like to address that first? Because I'd like to know what the challenges are, and I'd also like to know, you know, what are the steps, what are the instruments that can get us to those desired futures?
Yeah, so that's something that we're trying to understand ourselves at the moment. So we're really sort of moving into the middle phases of the project, where we're saying, okay, land use currently looks like this. We know what the historical drivers have been. We've got some ideas of what land use needs to look like in the future. How do we get there? What we do know is that there needs to be change at multiple levels of decision making. So that needs to be across citizens. All of us will need to change in some way our behaviours, because pretty much everything we do has an impact on land use. So the kinds of products that we consume, the ways that we choose to get around, that all has an impact on what our land use needs are in terms of the infrastructure and the way that those goods and services are provided. So we will all need to make some kind of change. And what we're doing in the project at the moment is starting to identify promising measures that engage people in changing to more sustainable behaviours, or behaviours that have more sustainable land use impacts. So we're exploring those at the moment. We're also looking at that planning level, so the level of land use planning, to think about how can the planning system incentivize these positive behaviours for people, provide the kind of infrastructures that are needed. Because it's not just an individual choice about individual behaviour. So for example, if I choose to ride my bike instead of driving my car, that has an impact on land use around what infrastructure I need to make that safe and accessible. And so we do need that planning level to be making those kinds of decisions about what infrastructure they provide, and therefore what land use looks like, what space they allocate to what. But then also, so that's the level of planning. And then there also needs to be change at the policy level to sort of create the ability for planners to be making those decisions and to be incentivizing those decisions. And what we find at the moment is that there's a real sort of pinch point at the level of planning. So one of our project deliverables or reports has just been sort of exploring these kinds of intervention points, so points in the policy decision-making system that we can really leverage to make big change. And this is one of them, that planning systems have multiple sort of policy goals coming down on them in multiple different directions that they sometimes somehow have to juggle and meet everything around housing, transport, agriculture, water management, green space provision. It all comes down then onto this sort of planning level to somehow deliver this and make decisions around trade-offs. Okay, so we're going to put housing here, and that means we lose this green space provision. They're making those decisions. But how do they do that in a way that also then engages with what people within that area want, that still continues to meet all of these goals and within the kinds of jurisdictions and responsibilities and powers that they actually have? So I've been quite non-specific because we're still in the middle of trying to unravel this ourselves in the project. But something around that, around matching responsibilities to abilities and capacities, I think is one of the big challenges we face in land use.
Okay, that's very interesting. You talked a bit about sort of planning as a driver of change, right? What are any other incentives that we need to kind of get us to those desirable futures? Obviously, policies there, economic incentives. What about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, economic incentives definitely need to play a role. And I think, so this is one of the things that why I keep coming back to the policy system, actually, because that's almost what shapes what is an economic incentive. There's this sort of broader, what we would call political economy. So if we look into particularly rural areas that have a significant amount of agricultural land, well, yeah, the policy system there is very much sort of incentivizing at the moment the need to produce and in quite an intensified way, so intense agricultural production. And it doesn't necessarily always make economic sense to do the most ecologically informed or the best, most sustainable land use practice. And there's other barriers in the way beyond economics as well, but you're going to do the thing that creates profit or at least keeps you afloat as an agricultural producer. And a lot of the more sort of sustainability measures are then sort of added on top. So, okay, you do this, you produce intensively and you use pesticides and fertilizers. And then at the same time, you can do a few things that are beneficial for the environment on top of that. And I think, instead of thinking about different land uses in separate boxes and separate sectors, we need to be thinking sort of more holistically about, okay, how do we create a more ecologically informed agriculture that is part of a sustainable land use? And that will require in sort of shifting what those economic incentives are. Which sounds like a fairly insurmountable task as I speak about it. But we're hoping to find ways within the system that we unlock these kinds of shifts and changes so that it makes more economic sense to be creating a thriving, sustainable landscape and thinking across different land uses.
All right, that's fantastic. Yeah, I love that idea of a kind of holistic approach to how we use the land. All right then, so the last question that I had for you, and we can go on to talk about other things if you'd like as well. What I wanted to know, you're obviously developing these sort of frameworks, these participatory processes. You've got the ideal landscapes that you mentioned. I've seen them on your web, really wonderful kind of illustrations of what things could be like. How are you going to ensure that everything you're developing in the project and in these practice regions is sort of adaptable, scalable, and applicable, because Europe has a huge diversity of geographical, cultural, and political contexts?
Yeah. Yes. And I think this is really a challenge actually around how do you I spoke about this question of specificity and diversity and the need for honoring all this different sort of range of cultures. And how do you do that while at the same time having policy goals that are applicable over a much broader area and a sort of a need for tools and techniques that are applied across much bigger areas than just an individual practice case or even 12 practice cases. It's a challenge, and it's something. There's something emerging, I think, from Plus Change that's really saying, yeah, it's not about having one big decision-making system that is going to be relevant for everywhere. Like, yes, such a thing can be useful, but then it needs to be used in very context-specific ways and with deliberation with people. So what we're aiming for is we do have the plan to produce a toolkit in the Plus Change project. And that toolkit should be usable by planners and decision makers to bring some of these big decision-making tools into local context. And so we're doing things like creating user stories of the different ways in which some of the tools in the project have been used across diverse contexts and for different purposes. An example of this would be sort of emerging from this possible landscapes process. We've created this busy picture. We always call it by its German name, the Wimmelbild, the sort of busy, rich picture. And it's this big sort of depiction of a town that we call Circuville. And it's got lots of different innovations and sustainable approaches depicted within this picture. And it can be used as a communication device to show people what's possible. But we're actually using it as a deliberation device in the project, as a way of engaging people and talking about what they want, what they don't want, what are the barriers to that, why do they think certain things don't work, what things would they like to see in their own community. And we will also be creating more tailored, smaller versions of the Wimmelbild for each of the practice cases through the project. But one of the ways that we can then use that is through user stories. So the ambassadors, some of them have been using it within their own communities. The practice cases are using it within their practice case. We in my institute, Czech Globe, we're about to take it to a big science fair and discuss it with lots of school kids and their parents. And so if we then create user stories from the way that we've rolled out these deliberative approaches, what we used them for, what worked, what didn't, what the outcomes of that were, we hope to be able to show that, okay, we can have a standard tool, but we can use that in lots of different ways that are then more place specific or community specific, and help to facilitate the kind of conversations that are needed, so that we're really coming back to this idea of deliberation, negotiation, participation in land use.
All right, wonderful. That sounds like your work is going to have some really far-reaching impacts, I think. Okay, so those were all the main questions that I had for you. Is there anything else that you would like to tell me about the project? Any key questions that I've neglected to ask you?
So I think one of the things that I'd like to point out is just we're really trying to tackle something which is huge here. I mean, this is a complex project that's dealing with a really complicated sort of situation. We've got climate change, we've got biodiversity, we've got human well-being. And we're noting that decision making is made at individual levels, at planning levels, at policy levels. And the way that we put it together can sound really big picture and insurmountable. And it's sort of like we're almost saying, okay, we've got to change everything. We've got to change the way that we approach everything. In the way that we view land use as not just agriculture, forestry, water, and so on, but putting everything together holistically and engaging with people and treating climate change and biodiversity as interlinked and part of social things. That it's big. And it's really about a lot of what we're doing in Plus Change is about acknowledging, yeah, it is big and it is complicated, but there are things that can be done. And we all have the power to do them. It's not just that we need to sit and wait for policy to change, even though a lot of the drivers of land use change come from policy and that political economic system. But actually, we can all participate in that change. We can all play a role somehow by putting forward what we want to see, by changing our own behaviours as much as we possibly can, and by engaging in the processes that are out there for us to engage in. And at the same time, we're then coming in with the Plus Change project and saying, and there are these really powerful ways that decision makers can then reach out to engage with people and to facilitate and start these conversations and raise awareness of how people interact with land for all of us, so that we're sort of spreading this idea of things can be different, things can be exciting, we can reach biodiversity and climate change goals while also delivering social well-being in a way that suits us within this community. And for me, that's sort of a really important guiding principle, really, within the work that we're doing in the Plus Change project.
All right, that's wonderful. I feel very inspired listening to you speak there. As you say, it is huge, but it does seem like, you know, if we all pull together, we can get there. So
yeah.
All right. Thank you then very much, Julia Leventon, for joining me and explaining the work that you're doing in the Plus Change project.
Thank you very much for having me.